Welcome to FacetNet and welcome to the exciting world of Cisco certification. In the last video of my CCNA series, we looked at the TCP/IP model and the overview. So today, in this one, I'm going to look at the TCP/IP layers. Especially, we are going to look at the application layer, and in that, I'm going to look at HTTP protocol. So let's quickly have a look. What is TCP/IP application layer? So the TCP/IP application layer protocols provide services to the application software running on a computer. So it's like web browsers and web servers, right? So we will go into that later on. So the application layer does not define the application itself, but it defines the services that the application needs. For example, an application layer protocol such as HTTP define how a web browser can get the content of a website from the hosted web server. So that's what the application layer does in TCP/IP. So based on that, let's have a look at what is HTTP and how does that work. So if you look at what really happens to allow a web page to display or to see and view on your web browser. So every time when you go into your web browser and type in a URL, it brings you a website. So what really happens when you do that? So if you look at this diagram, I have Bob here and I have a Larry here. So Bob is the web browser, which is the client side. Larry is the web server where you have hosted a website. So keep in mind, HTTP didn't exist until early 1990s. So later, after 1990s, only HTTP was introduced, right? So what really happens when you have a web server and a web browser? So if you look at it, Bob's initially request, technically he asked the Larry to send his home page back to him. So remember, every time when you type into a website, say for example facebook.com, it goes to facebook.com/home.htm. So something like it doesn't need to be home.htm. It should be defined in the web server what is their default home page. So whatever the default home page, that will be the initial request page. So when the request goes from Bob to Larry, Larry's web server, which could be an Apache or a different web servers, but most cases people use Apache, or otherwise they can use IIS, Microsoft based web server. So the web server software has been configured to know what is their default web page and what is content as like home.htm in this case. So what happened? Bob's then received the file from Larry, and then it comes to your web browser. It goes through the encapsulation, de-encapsulation process, and then it will be displayed on your web browser. So that's how simply a website works. So when you request a website, that's how it works simply, right? So keep in mind, in HTTP protocol, to make the request for a web page and return the content of the web page, the application uses HTTP protocol, which is called Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So that's the one we use here to send and receive a web page. So if you now look into this diagram here, I have like break down that simple request into 3 levels, just to give you a sort of a more detailed understanding. So if you see the step 1 here, so what really happens in step 1, Bob sent a message with an HTTP header. So technically within the HTTP header, Bob sent a message asking Larry, hey, can I get home.htm page, right? So it's a get request, right? So that get request goes to Larry's server, which is the Apache service. So Larry receives that and then responds back to the Bob's request, right? So when he responds, the message begins with an HTTP header. You can see here HTTP header, and inside the HTTP header there's a return code. It says OK, that has a number called 200. Sometimes you would have received an error message 404. That means if the request is failed, then HTTP returns 404 error. That means the page cannot be displayed, something like that, right? So it comes with the return code, and then it puts the message back in that folder, right? So back in the data. So you can see here in the data it got the HTML file. So HTTP also define other return codes, as I said, 404 and things like that. So what happens in the step 2? The message begins with an HTTP header with the return code 200, which means something like as simple as, okay, here is your file, right? So it sends the file back to Bob. Now, if you see that step 3, again we have a data and it says more of file home.html, but we don't see the HTTP header this time. It is the simple mechanism the web servers follows. What it really does is, if you keep on sending HTTP header with every single reply, that's adding an additional messages and additional overheads. That means it's an extra space. You're wasting some spaces. So HTTP server knows that it is the same file that I'm sending back to the same user, so I don't need to send the HTTP header information, and it just transfers the data only. So in step 3, it shows simply that a message without the HTTP header. So HTTP transfer the data by sending multiple messages, each with a part of the file that it was requested. So what happened, it rather than wasting the space by sending a repeated HTTP header, that it just sends the data only. So it omits the header. So that's how the HTTP works in TCP IP application layer. Hope that makes sense.